Ministry inspired a variety of genres and sounds in the 1980s and 90s. Starting off as a new wave and synth-pop act, they would evolve into heavier territory with each album. The team of Al Jourgensen and Paul Barker, in addition to a revolving lineup of skilled musicians, would lead a musical revolution with industrial and electronic music. Many following bands would run with the formula that Ministry pioneered. After the success of several albums, Ministry would release Filth Pig in 1996. Their most challenging album to date, Filth Pig was yet another new sound that would win some fans, but lose others. Opinions toward the album would become more positive over time, but what was it about Filth Pig that divided Ministry fans? A look into the past is needed to understand the different aspects of Filth Pig. In 1988, The Land of Rape and Honey was all about what could be done with synthesizers and the Fairlight CMI. There were all kinds of different sounds, a variety of timbres, and a lot of samples that carried the songs. It also incorporated the cut-up technique inspired by William Burroughs, a method that wasn't commonly used in music. But the Fairlight was put to the test by this album. Stigmata was considered Ministry's first metal moment, and was revered as a big guitar track. No actual guitars are on the album version of Stigmata, those are Fairlight-sampled guitars you're hearing. And if you listen close enough, there's also a sampled saxophone underneath the riff. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. While it was mostly electronic, there was still a wide-open punk energy amidst the tracks. On the next album, The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, the electronics, sample-heavy songs, and sonic assaults were still there. Where The Land of Rape and Honey used programmed drums, The Mind had the powerhouse that was Bill Rieflin on a real kit. Automatically, this made for a more organic and live-sounding album, even with the loops, samples, and still some programmed percussion everywhere. Oh, and there were also more guitars. Some of them may have been edited to death, but the whole recording was just pandemonium. 1992 rolls around with Psalm 69. All of the ingredients of the past two albums are there, and yes, even the Fairlight is still being used. The difference is that the songs are more guitar-centered and straightforward. During the first half are the high-energy, aggressive anthems like New World Order, Just One Fix, and Jesus Built My Hot Rod. On the second half are the slower and darker songs, such as Scarecrow and Psalm 69. It also sounds more like a band playing together, so it's not quite as mechanical, but there are still walls of sound all over the album. Jesus Built My Hot Rod, for instance, is absolute disjointed chaos. The drums and guitars are in different time signatures, and Gibby Haynes is drunk out of his mind scat singing along. It sounds like if you were to throw a wrench in there, it would all crash and explode gloriously. Psalm 69 had a sound that appealed to alternative audiences of the time. New fans were won over, and they'd gain even more on the Lollapalooza tour following the album. Rape and Honey, Mind, and Psalm all had songs that were perfect for the mosh pit. Plus, there were many nights where Ministry had to pay fines for deliberately playing over the allowed decibel levels. They knew what they were doing, and people loved them for it. Filth Pig would take 4 years to follow Psalm 69. In that time frame, Nine Inch Nails released The Downward Spiral, Marilyn Manson, Tool, and White Zombie would take over, and many Nine Inch Nails wannabe bands would flood the market. People were thinking, well, if Ministry is taking so long, then the next album is probably going to be the biggest thing ever, especially with all this stuff coming out in the meantime. Well, in 1996, the wait was finally over. Just look at that artwork. The colors make it stick out, and there's the trademark Ministry humor. It's time for the high-energy macho sounds as expected from Ministry. It didn't take long to figure out that this wasn't the same Ministry. The songs were slow, minimal, depressing to the point of nihilism, and unsettling to listen to. Filth Pig wasn't an album with loud radio anthems like New World Order. This was heavy. Ministry sounded more like a band playing together, with sludgy, looser, and more groove-oriented songs. Samples and electronics were very few and far between, none of them dominating the tracks in the way that they used to. This was a more stripped-down, less mechanical version of Ministry. Much of the fanbase did not take this new direction well. In fact, it was a dividing point. But Ministry was never a band that pandered to its audience. Ministry did what Ministry wanted. It's actually a ballsy move that this late into their career, they decided to play a very inaccessible style for the time. It could be compared to the Melvins' Atlantic Trilogy. Even though they were on big labels and pushing big sales, both bands were still making unusually harsh music. Given the years of evolution towards a more live sound, it makes sense. They've already established their place in the world of electronic and industrial music. They've already shown that they could do layers upon layers of sound with different elements. They've already shown that they could do things that were unheard of with synths, drum machines, and studio gear. Now they're going to show you what they can do without the bells and whistles. But it was just as much of a reflection of lifestyles as it was an evolution in their career. Behind the scenes, Al Jourgensen was dealing with depression and a nasty heroin addiction. Paul Barker left the band in 2003, but he almost left for good during the making of Filth Pig. Al and Paul tried owning their own studio in Texas, but faced a lot of technical difficulties as well as other complications. Arguments and tempers ensued, and after some turbulence, the album was finished at Chicago Tracks. Barker may have stayed, but in the middle of recording, Bill Rieflin was out. He was replaced by Ray Washam, but both are heard on the album. All of the dysfunction really shows in the final product. 7 of 10 songs are past the 5-minute mark, though the fall only misses by 5 seconds. Man, that almost made a simplified fraction. 8 out of 10 is 4 out of 5. But we're not talking about math, we're talking about ministry! Most of these songs have 1 or 2 main riffs that are repeated throughout and act as the foundation of the song. On paper this sounds like it would be boring, but the minimal amount of riffs make it easier for the songs to stick with you. Repetition of the riffs can also be hypnotic. Just take Lava. It also sounds like they jammed these songs as a band. In the past, Al and Paul edited takes and quantized everything to sound tight. Here there's more concern over the songs and end products instead of the individual elements within them. As a result, everything sounds looser. This is also lyrically different. Ministry always had a political element to the music, but this time the lyrics are more personal. Something that sets Filth Pig apart is the sound quality. Al and Paul used a lot of studio wizardry to create unique sounding albums, and this is no exception. For the drums they used tape distortion, giving plenty of punch and snap. The guitars, down-tuned to D, have incredible tones. They were recorded with a Marshall JMP, with a tone that's sharp enough for industrial, but meaty enough for sludge. Barker's bass is part of what made the classic Ministry sound, and it's even bigger here. It's very distorted and thick, complementing the guitars nicely while often doing its own thing. There were several stomp boxes and effects used on different tracks, one of them being the Maestro Brassmaster, which would later be remade by Maleko Heavy Industry, a synth and effect company by Barker and business partner Josh Hawley. Because the songs are slower, the mixes are more bass-heavy. Not only that, but Filth Pig's mix is a good example of less being more. Now there aren't dozens of sound effect tracks fighting each other in the mix, so there's more space for the few instruments that are there. Speaking of instruments, there are a few eclectic instruments on the album. There's harmonica, the B3 organ, pedal steel guitar, mandolin, and even a piano solo. It all makes sense within the context of the music, and as always, Al has all kinds of harmonizers and effects on his vocals. Confrontational and violent from the get-go, the album opens with Reload. It's one of the faster songs of the album, and the most industrial sounding. In just 2.5 minutes you get 3 main riffs, with 2 of them sounding like the note patterns are switched. There are clever lyrics like, sounds of machinery exist during the break, and so does a jangling mandolin to creep you out. Then there's the bass-driven title track. Despair oozes from every corner with an unconventional drum beat. When the guitars come in, it slams. What slams just as hard is the harmonica after the drum solo. Just to remind you that this train of doom isn't stopping anytime soon. You'll be asking, how do you sleep at night? Third on the album is a Volcanoes theme song, Lava. The main riff just stays with you. It sounds like a bass, but the bass is only thumping the first 2 quarter notes of each walk up and down. Playing with the bass is a guitar that's been transposed down an octave with an eventide harmonizer, so you know it's heavy. It's just a little faster than Filth Pig, but the drums are still staying busy. There's a good creep factor too, with the guitar chorus effect during the break and the sample. The harmonica is spicing things up here too. Crumbs is a zany ripper with some more clever lyrics. Everyone gets a chance to shine. A bass solo, 2 guitar solos, and hard-hitting drums with subtle ghost notes. There's still the moody element, like the I Never Had a Life sample.
I never had a life. I don't even know what life is.
For the first time doing vocals on a Ministry track, Useless has Paul Barker leading the way. Given that it's one of Ministry's darker works, it helps to have the sneering and robotic approach behind the microphone. It's a dissonant tread with more political commentary than the rest of the album. The drum line includes toms, and the bass walks itself unleashed from the 6th string. Starting side 2 is Dead Guy. It kinda sounds like a Helmet song, with some rapped vocals and wah guitar action. Pretty aggressive with its stop and start riffs. Game Show is the psychedelic long one. Starting off with a circus sound and staying with the dirgy bass, it's demented to the max. But there's a contrast with the vocals. Perhaps it's the first instance of Al Jourgensen doing his calmer, Morrison-esque style that would be heard on the next album. There's lots of spacey echo and atmosphere, with some choir-sounding background vocals in places. The Fall was one of the album's singles. Very noisy, though in a calming and hypnotic way. With the slow shuffling drum rhythm mixing with the diabolical notes, this would be the song you'd go to if you needed a reminder that there's no hope in anything. What makes this more memorable is the melodic piano in several parts. It's hard to get more organic than that. Next to last is a cover of Bob Dylan's Lay Lady Lay. This is the oddball of the album. Many wondered, why cover Bob Dylan? And of all of his songs, why this one?
Lay, lady, lay, lay across my big brass bed.
Well, it was all Al's idea. He loved Bob Dylan. Even a couple of his bandmates weren't crazy about the song, but just examining it for what it is, it's a total reinterpretation of the original, typical of how Bob would change his songs live. Even though it's more lighthearted than the rest of the album, there's still the dismal feeling that goes with the vibe of Filth Pig. Al is just belting it out here. There's even some acoustic guitar, a pedal steel, and the great B3 organ. When the band throws that wall of sound at you during the chorus, it really comes in strong. Absolutely beautiful. Finally, Brick Windows ends the album the same way it came in, fast and with constant pounding. The beginning of the song is a bad guitar jack and toggle that Al and Paul decided to leave in because they thought it sounded cool. It has a somewhat friendlier, more lighthearted tone. There's even a few measures where it's just the guitar solo and the drums. Filth Pig was ultimately an album that was misunderstood upon release. Many people turned their back on Ministry. However, a number of those same people would come back later to reevaluate the album and see the good in it. Some would still prefer the faster version of Ministry with the synthesizers and drum machines. But for those who didn't mind the slow speeds, it was just another masterpiece from the band. Ministry set out to make a heavy album, and they pegged out on filth.